Ever feel like some piyutim just don't flow right, as if the stanzas are out of order? Join us for a historical detective journey as we trace the piyut V'chol Maaminim and explore its possible connection to the enigmatic poet Yannai, whose true genius was hidden for centuries. We'll uncover forgotten clues from the Cairo Geniza and reveal the song's original elegant structure. Finally, we'll explore how key ideas from Chasidus unlock profound messages within its stanzas, a perfect way to enter the new year. We're going to look now at the piyut of V'chol Maaminim, and in the first passage on the page, it's the way it appears in the Chabad Machzor, what we're going to call the new print, the new editions of the Chabad Machzor. Starting in the early 2000s, around 2003, there was a new layout of the Machzor. This affected the English version of the Machzor, so the versions with the English translation, but as well as the standard, regular Hebrew version, a person can buy this newer layout. So we're going to start with this newer layout. So in this piyut of V'chol Maaminim, Shu Kelamuna, right before the piyut, right before this composition, there's a few words. Ha'eches b'yad midas mishpat, he who holds on to the attribute of judgment. And that's those are the opening words. And then after that we have the words V'chol Maaminim shu kelamuna. Everyone believes that Hashem is a trustworthy God, Haboichen uvoide ginzei nistaros, who examines and determines the inner secrets. Then we have the next line, V'chol Maaminim shu boichen kloyos, and that the V'chol Maaminim is on the right-hand side of the composition of the page. Everyone believes that God is assessing what's going on the inside of a person, Hagoyel mimaves, and He redeems from death, Ufoida mishachas, and again, the theme of redemption from a state of destruction. And so this is a beautiful piyut of the V'chol Maaminim. However, when we read this piyut, we notice immediately a few questions that arise. First of all, right at the top, I opened with the words Ha'eches b'yad midas mishpat, and those four words just seem to be hanging there. Maybe we can call them a widow, like they're just words that are hanging there that don't seem to have a pair. Question number one. Question number two, when you get all the way at the end to the piyut, the last few words is V'chol Maaminim shu tamim paloi, and as you can see, the way they laid it out on the page, that too is not on the right-hand side, it's at the center, and that also doesn't have a pair. That is an orphan. Why do we have a piyut with a widow and an orphan? That's question number one. Question number two is that when we look at this piyut, we'll notice something interesting about the sequence of the aleph beis. We know that many of these compositions follow the order of the aleph beis. So if you start on the right-hand side, V'chol Maaminim shu kelamuna, that's an aleph. Haboichen uvoide kinzei nistaros, so haboichen is a beis. Right? The second word, they're not going to count the hey of haboichen because that line, everything begins with a hey. So aleph beis. But then on the next line, V'chol Maaminim shu boichen kloyos, boichen is a beis. And then you get a gimel. So in other words, the seder is aleph beis, beis gimel. Gimel dalid. Dalid hey. So that's very odd. It's very odd to have aleph beis, beis gimel. And then gimel dalid. This is this would be an anomaly in the way piyutim are generally structured, and it definitely calls for us to go further and make a closer examination. Moreover, when we look at these lines, we'll notice that there isn't really any connection between the V'chol Maaminim on the right-hand side and the descriptions on the left-hand side. So for example, if you say that God is Kelemuna, a trustworthy God, and then you say Haboichen uvoide ginzei nistaros, that He's looking into secret things, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection between the V'chol Maaminim and the left-hand side. Likewise, the next one, if you go V'chol Maaminim shu boichen kloyos, that God is determining what's going on the inside, and then you talk about redeeming from death, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection between the two. Likewise, on the next one, if you go V'chol Maaminim shu goyel chazak, that He's a strong redeemer, on the next line, when you get Hadon Yechidi Levoi Olam, that he's the sole judge for all inhabitants of the earth, there doesn't seem to be a connection between the right-hand side and the left-hand side. Okay, so these are pretty obvious questions, and this led someone not specifically because of this layout of the Machzor, because of other layouts of the Machzor as well, to write a letter to an editor for a journal that comes out in Karlin-Stolin around 2003. And he said, maybe there's something that went terribly wrong when it comes to this piyut. Maybe you need to read it like this. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos. I'm going to start by base. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos, and then pretend like you're a horse playing chess. One up, one to the left. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos, ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares. V'chol Maaminim shul goyal chazak, ha-goyal mimaves ufoida mishachas. V'chol Maaminim shul dayon emes, ha-don yechidi levoy oila. This was his solution to this problem. And what does that give us? What that gives us is suddenly now it makes sense. You have a beis and a beis. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloya is beis. Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares is beis. V'chol Maaminim shul goyal chazak gimel. Ha-goyal mimaves ufoida mishachas gimel. He went further to suggest, and that this also makes sense in terms of the toichen. Now you say, V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos, that's on the theme of what? Determining what's going on the inside. Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares is also about determining the hidden matters. V'chol Maaminim shul goyal chazak, he's a strong redeemer. Ha-goyal mimaves ufoida mishachas. He's the one who redeems from death. The word goyal in both. So maybe something went terribly wrong over here. And then he suggested further and said, maybe once upon a time you had V'chol Maaminim shul keila muna, and there was another half to that got lost. This is what he suggested. Okay, we're going to come back to this, but before we do so, let's go now to the more typical way this piyut appears in a Machzor. So in the more traditional prints of this Chabad Machzor that were printed earlier in the 20th century, you can see that on the bottom of the page. And here you see there is no introductory phrase hanging in the middle. Rather, it goes ha'oiches biad midas mishpat on the right hand side, and to the left of that it goes V'chol Maaminim shul keila muna. Now, if you were to take this layout literally, what would that mean? That would mean ha'oiches biad midas mishpat is part 1, and V'chol Maaminim shul keila muna is part 2. Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares is part 1. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos is part 2. Now, this would also be a solution to our problems, because then you would, number one, you don't have a widow and an orphan hanging in the beginning and the end. Number 2, you have an aleph corresponding with an aleph, right? Ha'oiches biad midas mishpat, that's an aleph. V'chol Maaminim shul keila muna, that's an aleph. Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares is a beis. V'chol Maaminim shul boichen kloyos is a beis. So, and the toichen matches. The toichen matches very well. The exact same reason that guy told us before the toichen was going to match, except that he was telling us that V'chol Maaminim comes first, and then the corresponding line comes second. And what we're seeing in the typical layout is you have a corresponding, what we call the corresponding line on the right hand side, and then V'chol Maaminim on the left hand side. So this would be fine, nice, cute. I mean, not cute, but nice and good, and everything will be great. There's just one problem. No one sings it that way. The song is not known as Ha'oiches biad midas mishpat. No one says, come, let's sing Ha'oiches biad midas mishpat. People say, come, let's sing V'chol Maaminim. And no matter who you're going to listen to, no matter which version of the song you're going to listen to, by which singer, they're all going to start the song by V'chol Maaminim. And that's how we sing it in Shul. And that's how in the Chazan, whether he does Chazanis, or whether he does Nusach, whether he does heavy Nusach or light Nusach, or whether it's always going to start with V'chol Maaminim shul keila muna as the first half, and Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares is going to be the second half. In fact, in Sefer HaNigunim, Nigun Nun Beis, we have a Nigun from Rabbi Yechiel the Chazan, who was the Chazan in Lubavitch, documented that in the 1900s, the first decade of the 1900s and thereafter, he used to sing this Nigun, the Nigun that's known in Chabad, V'chol Maaminim. It begins with V'chol Maaminim, and Ha-boichen ovede ginzei nistares responds to the V'chol Maaminim. And so, that leaves us with the question of, on the one hand, you have a layout here. The layout's perfect, except for the fact that it doesn't correspond with how we're singing it. So what are we supposed to make of all of this? Okay, so we'll come back to all of this later on, but now let's learn a little bit about the background of this piyut. So we mentioned already 2 editions of the Machzor printed by Kahas. We'll mention another edition that came out just a few years ago. It's called the Machzor Imleket Biurei Chasidus. This came out in 2021, Tavshin Pei Aleph. Looks like it was produced by people in Eretz Yisrael. The primary objective of this machzer is to produce on the bottom of the page short summaries of what Chasidus says about the davening. Okay. Along the way, they decided they're also going to give background information about the piyutim. So when it comes to the piyut of V'chol Maaminim, this is what they write. V'chol Maaminim, hinoi piyut kadum. This is a very early composition. Hamayuchaz lepaiton, and it is attributed to the Paiton Sheshmoi, the poet, Sheshmoi Yannai, whose name is Yannai. All right, you can tell from the way they're writing over here is they're not expecting the reader to ever have heard of this person. So when do you say it was written by a person whose name was Yannai, as opposed to saying it was written by Yannai? In other words, they're assuming none of us heard of Yannai, and with good reason they're making that assumption. And they're telling us that this piyut is meyuches to this man named Yannai. Who is this man Yannai? They tell us one piece of information. Yesh hasvurim, some hold, ki haya rabbi shel Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler, that he was the rabbi of Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler. Oh, now we're in familiar territory. Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler is a familiar name. We spoke about him in previous classes when it came to the machzer. I'll summarize one key point in a moment. And here they're telling us that Yannai was his teacher. So if Yannai is his teacher, that gives us a little bit of familiarity about who we are talking about. This is the information they give us right before the piyut of V'chol Maaminim in this machzer. Now, what did we say about Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler in the earlier classes? What we spoke about just briefly, one of the points we spoke about is the fact that some of the Rishonim in Ashkenaz referred to him as a Tana. I then pointed out that some of the Achronim, interestingly, did not accept the fact that he was a Tana, namely the Yavitz, the Chida, and even Rabbi Avram David Lavat in the Shara HaKol. Getting into the details of that discussion is beyond the scope of today's conversation. But that was in terms of Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler. If he's not a Tana, so when does he live? He lives after the era, the Talmud, I don't know, sometime the 600s, an era, somewhere like that. Okay. So we need to do some digging over here. We want to learn about this Yannai. Who is this Yannai? Why should we assume, or should we assume, that he is indeed the author of V'chol Maaminim? And where does this idea come from that he was the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler? This is the investigative work we need to do today. And so, it turns out that this individual by the name of Yannai is basically completely absent from the literary record. And when I say literary record, I mean the typical svarim that Jews had access to until very recently. A lot changed in the last few decades. But I'm saying during the period of the Rishonim, if we look back at the typical books and works that were available from Rishonim and either from the Achronim, we barely ever find the name Yannai mentioned at all, as opposed to Rabbi Eliezer HaKoler, I mentioned before. He's mentioned by the Balei HaTosfos, he's mentioned by the Gedolei Achronim. Yannai is very different. There is one reference that was known and seen by many people, and this comes from the Shibbolei HaLeket, which was written by Reb Tzidkiah HaRoifa in the 1300s. And here he himself is going to be quoting a much earlier rabbi. He's going to be quoting Rabbeinu Gershom Moer HaGoyla. Rabbeinu Gershom Moer HaGoyla lived in the first half of the 11th century, and Reb Tzidkiah HaRoifa here is going to quote a passage from Rabbeinu Gershom, a tshuva from Rabbeinu Gershom. Let's read inside together. Shibbolei HaLeket. In Shibbolei HaLeket HaShalom, this is Siman Chav Ches. Uv'shem Rabbeinu Gershom Zatzal Matzasi. I found in the name of Rabbeinu Gershom. Ma shahoyra lachem hachaver shaloy lispalo kroives b'seichat tefillah. This that you had a certain rabbi told you. We don't know who Rabbeinu Gershom is corresponding with, but he's corresponding with someone who a rabbi told him, don't insert the kroives, more on that in a minute, into the davening on Chagim, Moyadim, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. So in other words, someone wrote to Rabbeinu Gershom, I don't know what to do. There's a great rabbi, we don't know who this person is, we don't know who the rabbi is, who told me not to put in these kroivos, which are essentially the insertions that we do Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and Minig Ashkenaz does on many special days and Yom Tovim, and you shouldn't insert them. We know that way back when, from day one, there was always a debate about this. Is this a good idea to make these insertions? Is it a hefsek? Is it not a hefsek? Etc. And so someone's writing to Rabbeinu Gershom, oh, this person is telling me that I shouldn't do it. So Rabbeinu Gershom responds First of all, by quoting a number of Go'ainim from Bavel, specifically from the yeshiva in Sura, who supported inserting piyutim. And therefore he quotes them and says, you see, it's a good thing. So, and therefore you should accept the idea Rabbeinu Gershom was pro-piyut, and he's telling this person, you should be willing to accept it. Then he's going to add a second passage. And that second passage is, V'gam yesh lanu lilmoid min ha'paitonim harishonim shoyich chachamim gedolim. In fact, we don't need to look for rabbinic sources, so to speak, from Piskei Dinim. We can look back at the very composers themselves. And once we establish that these composers were great rabbis, then by definition it means it's a good idea, not a bad idea. And then he's going to start telling us about who these great rabbis were. But first, one break. I want to also come back to the word kroivos and what we spoke about in a previous class, and I'll just summarize as well. The assumption is, if you look at the Talmud Yerushalmi, on numerous occasions it refers to the Chazan as a kroiva. And in fact, there's a passage in Yerushalmi, Maseches Brachos, where it says that when the Gabbai of the shul goes over to a Chazan and says, I want you to go down lehispalel, go to be mispalel. It says, don't say, go be mispalel. It says, boy ukrav. Boy ukrav. And the Gemara, the Yerushalmi explains, because the word ukrav is such a good word, it means so many things. First of all, it means lashon carbon, and tefillah is similar to a carbon. And secondly, battle. And we know tefillah is a battle with the negative forces or whatever it is. Zohar speaks about the fact that it's a battle as well. And so, and it goes on to say other benefits of the word kroiva. And that's why it uses for the chazan this term, for tefillah and for chazan, it uses the term kroiva. And so from there it got extended that these extra insertions that the chazan would do on these special days were often called kroivos. Of course, there's a more famous name that we have from later sources that first of all pronounce it as kroivitz, and second of all see it as an acronym for that these are songs, so Kol Rina Vishua Ba'ale Tzadikin. Okay, so we mentioned these points in a previous class, but when we see the word kroivos over here, this is what the reference is to these piyutim that we are going to, in a few days on Rosh Hashanah, we're going to be doing a lot of kroivos, and on Yom Kippur as well. Okay, so back to Rabbeinu Gershom, first of all, back to Reb Tzidkiya HaRoif, who's quoting Rabbeinu Gershom, who's saying it's a good idea to do piyutim. Number one, I have evidence from the Goinim. Number two, I have evidence from the composers themselves, who were chachamim gedolim. Okay, sample one. Harei Reb Yannai, shehoya min hachachamim harishonim. First of all, he quotes this Yannai, a man by the name of Yannai, and he tells you that he's from chachamim harishonim. And upiyet kroivos, and he made kroivos l'chol seder v'seder shalachal hashana. Very vague term. For every seder of the whole year. We're going to come back to that. What does that mean? He made these we know what it means to make for Yom Tov, but it doesn't say he made for Yom Tov. It says here he made l'chol seder v'seder shalachal hashana. Okay, so Rabbi Yannai is evidence of the fact, good idea to do piyutim. Number two, V'gam also Rabbi Elazar ber Rab Kolir min hachachamim harishonim. Elazar ber Rab Kolir, he too, sometimes he's called HaKolir, sometimes ber Rab Kolir. He too was from Chachamim Harishonim. Interestingly, Rabbeinu Gershom does not call him a Tana, and if he would have thought he was a Tana, he definitely would have mentioned him as a Tana, because that would give him more of a ranking. And upiyet kroivos l'chol haragolim, he made for all the Yamim Tovim. Okay, so you see, Rabbi Elazar HaKolir, we know exactly what he made. He made for the Yamim Tovim, we get that. Rabbi Yannai did something l'chol seder v'seder shalachal hashana. We don't really know exactly what that means right now, but what's his main point? His main point is v'yesh lilmoid mehan. Learn from all of these sources, specifically Yannai and Elazar HaKolir. Loi levatal kroivos, do not stop this program. Ad kan shuvas Rabbeinu Gershom Mor. Agoyla, this is the tshuva of Rabbeinu Gershom. It's also interesting that in this tshuva he brings Yannai first and Elazar HaKolir second, which indicates that Rabbi Yannai was more important. Either he was earlier, or more important, or both of them together, which often they do come together. So in terms of looking at basic literary sources that could be found on a bookshelf from the Rishonim or Achronim, this is basically the only mention that mentions a piyut by the name of Yannai. And beyond that, you don't really have anything. And as a result, for most of Jewish history, if someone would say, tell me anything about Yannai, not much would have been able to be said. Now, what happens is that during the 1800s, there's a number of historians that start looking into this whole field of piyutim, where do they come from, who made them, etc. And as part of this, they started looking into this individual Yannai. And as part of this effort, there was a paragraph from a manuscript that's Hamburg number 17 that they called attention to. So this, first a note about this manuscript. So as I alluded to before, it's in the Hamburg State University Library. It was copied as a colophon. So it tells us when it was copied. It was copied in the year 1317. What does it consist of? It consists of an Ashkenazi commentary to the piyutim that were said in Ashkenaz during the year. Okay. So there's this one, and I have an image of it on the left-hand side if you want to read it in the original. So there is a kroiva that was said for the special Shabbos of the Shabbos before Pesach, otherwise known as Shabbos HaGadol. And this kroiva is known by Oine Pitre Rachmosayim. And before he goes on to start giving a commentary on this, let me just add a word about this commentary. It was copied in the year 1317. That's when a scribe sat down to write down this material. But the material is earlier and no one knows exactly when. But you're clearly dealing with a work from the era of the Rishonim. Okay. So the anonymous, we don't know who's speaking, who's telling us this, but this is what he says. The world says that this piyut, Oine Pitre Rachmasayim, Shehi Yesoid Rabbi Yannai. Spelled a little different, Yud Yud Nun Yud in the manuscript. That this piyut was created by Rabbi Yannai, and in fact doesn't say it here, but if you look at the piyut, you actually can find his name written out as an acrostic. Who was Rabbi Yannai? Rabban Shel Rav Elazar bar Rab Kalir. He was the rabbi of Rabbi Elazar bar Rab Kalir. Now we understand why someone would say that Yannai is Rabbi Elazar ben Kalir's teacher. We saw that in the Machzer that we were speaking about before. Well, it probably is rooted in this passage over here from the Hamburg manuscript number 17. Okay, but then this note continues to say something shocking. Avol, V'chol Eretz Lombardia, that's the region in northern Italy, Ein oimrim oisa. They don't say this kroiva, Oine Pitre Rachmasayim. Why? Why don't they say it? Ki oimrim alav, because they say about this Yannai, sheniskanoi b'Rabbi Elazar talmidoi, that he was jealous of his student Rabbi Elazar HaKalir. Remember, I mentioned Rabbi Yannai. I mentioned is mentioned once in the Tshuva Rabbeinu Gershon, and no one really ever spoke about him for hundreds of years, and he was just out of people's minds. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir loomed very large for Jews in Ashkenaz. In the period of the Rishonim, everyone knew his name. Everyone knew certain compositions that were clearly written by him. There was a discussion if he's a Tana or not. So he loomed large, and so I guess the question was why? I didn't mean the question, but the reality is that he was, in a sense, more successful. At least in Ashkenaz, in that world, in Europe, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir is more successful. So that feeds into a story here that was said that Yannai was jealous of Rabbi Elazar, his student, who was more successful. V'hitil akrav b'minalai, he put a scorpion in his shoe, v'hargai, and he killed his student. All right, this is why in Lombardy they don't say this piyut. Now, the anonymous author goes on and says, Yislach Hashem l'chala oimrim alav im lo kein haya. May God forgive whoever says this if that's not what happened. This is a very interesting type of comment. This is a very, very interesting tale that we're being told of here, but I want to highlight the idea that Yannai is Rabbi Elazar HaKalir's teacher, as far as I know, only comes from here. And here also says that the reason they don't do it in Lombardy, they don't say this piyut, is because Yannai killed a student, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir. By the way, in terms of, there's a famous passage in Gemara that people don't get jealous of their children or their students. So I guess somehow we would have to say that every rule maybe has an exception to the rule. But the real reason to doubt the veracity of the story is, could you imagine Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagoyla invoking his name and saying that he's a raya and that he's a source and bringing him before Rabbi Elazar HaKalir if he believed that he was a murderer? Moreover, the person who documented this in the notes went ahead and gave the whole piyut and gave a commentary to the piyut, which is probably why he said, may God forgive all the people if this is not what happened. In other words, he himself probably didn't believe that it happened. But anyway, the fact is, in Lombardy, it seems that there were some Jews that believed it happened, which brings you to the discussion, by the way. Can you separate the art from the artist, right? The Chakira HaYadua. So this Chakira HaYadua goes back to the Yannai. And maybe you say the people in Lombardy felt that you can separate the art from the artist, and maybe other Jews in Europe felt that you could. Okay, that's B'derech HaTzachos. All right, let's continue along. The bottom line is that during the 1800s, this is pretty much, we knew at Tshuva Rabbeinu Gershom, we have this one manuscript that gives us a little information. What else do we know about this individual? Bits and pieces were found here and there. Ultimately, there was very, very little in terms of knowing about who this man was and when he lived, where he lived, and also in terms of what his output was. There wasn't much to point to other than this piyut of Pesach and maybe one other thing, very, very little. And as a result, when the Jewish Encyclopedia was published in 1906, they made an entry for Yannai because he was already an individual, and so they made an entry for him, and this is how the entry concludes. This is the last line. The extant examples of Yannai's work do not indicate any great poetic talent. If I had to say it, I would say the 19th century was a bad century for Yannai. I mean, he's accused of murder. Then the Jewish Encyclopedia says that the one or two pieces of his poetry that have remained aren't too impressive. I'm not sure which, there are multiple authors to this piece. I don't know which one is the one who determined this to be the case, but it was not a good century. But don't worry, just because things are down, it doesn't mean it can turn around. Soon things are going to turn around for our friend Yannai. And when is it going to turn around? It's going to turn around, as with many things in Jewish literature, with the Cairo Geniza. When the Cairo Geniza was discovered in the late 1800s, one of the first items that was printed that was considered to be very, very valuable for the non-Jewish world was what you see on the top left of the page. I know it's very hard to see. Let me tell you what this is. This is in the Cambridge University Library today. It's in the Taylor Schechter collection, number 12182. And what this is you have Hebrew writing here. That you could see clearly. If you look really well on the page, you may be able to see that there are also strokes in much lighter letters that are behind the Hebrew text. And indeed there are. And the image is bad. If you can see a real image, you see it very clearly. And this was very usual in those days. We learned in Pirkei Avos about writing on fresh paper versus writing on Yar Mochok. What was Yar Mochok? Today, there isn't really a secondary paper market. There used to be a normal thing, a secondary paper market. Why? Because parchment was so expensive to make and produce. So if you wrote something or you had a book and you didn't need it anymore, it wouldn't go to the garbage. People would erase the ink and then put new ink on, but it leaves a rosham. It leaves an imprint to the original one. Here, apparently, what you had was a Greek translation of parts of Tanakh. Now, that was very valuable for people who were interested in learning about Tanakh in the Greek. And many in the non-Jewish world were very interested in that, which is why this was published very early on in the late 1800s. This was already published, and it was amazing. Wow, a Greek translation. We don't even have this Greek translation anymore, and all of that. We're not going to get so much into this topic today. But all of that was the machuk. That was the stuff that was written on the bottom. And the Hebrew, which was in everyone's faces, everyone ignored, because who cares, whatever. I don't know what it is. People basically didn't really care too much about it. It took a number of decades for people to actually read this closely. And there were those who study piyut, and they started looking at the acrostics over here, and they found, first of all, Yannai's name. Yannai's name is presented in these piyut. By the way, it's always, when it's in a piyut, it's always Yud Nun, Yud Yud. That's the way it is. Yud Nun, Yud Yud. Yannai's name. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, it's very clearly talking about Parshas HaShavua. Very clearly talking about Parshas HaShavua. But it's also very clear, the way it talks, it's very clear that it's not one piyut for Parshas Tazrian, another for Parshas Metzora, and another for Achrei Mos. What we would consider Parshas Tazria, there's actually multiple piyutim. And it didn't take too long to figure out what's going on over here. We know from the Gemara that in Eretz Yisrael, they read the Torah in a triennial cycle, 3 years. And we even know what it was. We have in some Tanakh, Kisvei Yad of Tanakh, we have exactly what the 3-year cycle looked like, what they read each week. This piyut of Yannai, is basically a piyut for each week's parsha on the triennial cycle. And that's what was here on these pages. Again, in the background, you had the Greek. And basically, there was a Greek translation to the Torah. Someone at a certain point said, we don't need that anymore, we're going to erase it, and we're going to put instead something else that actually is related. It is somewhat related. I mean, you could read a Greek translation in Shul, you could do piyutim in Shul. There may even be some relationship between, we no longer need Greek translation to the Torah, we do now need piyutim related to the parsha of the week. And now go back to the text that Rabbeinu Gershom Mar HaGoyla wrote that no one really understood what meant for many centuries. He said, Rabbi Yannai, shahaya min hachachamim harishonim, upiyet kroivais l'chol seder v'seder shalachal hashana. Seder. In fact, the word seder is the word they used. We today in Yiddish, you could say the parsha, you could say the sedra. So it's actually originally the seder, that word referred specifically to the triennial cycle, and that's exactly what Rabbeinu Gershom Mar HaGoyla was referring to. And now all of a sudden, there's much more of Yannai's work that was available for analysis. And one of the first things people were able to tell is that this line, that it does not indicate any great poetic talent, was probably spoken a little too soon. Okay, so that is a general overview about this individual Yannai. And then we come to the question of, and by the way, there was more pieces that were found over the years, mostly in the Cairo Geniza, and so some picture was put in terms of who we're talking about, when he lived and all of that. Now let's come to the question of our piyut, otherwise known as V'chol Maaminim, or Ha'oiches Biad Midas Mishpat. So we saw in that machzer, it said that it is attributed to Yannai. So where did that come from? How is this piyut attributed to Yannai? If you look in V'chol Maaminim up and down, try as you might look for Yannai's name as an acrostic, or for that matter, any name, you're not going to find any name as an acrostic in the piyut. I should highlight that generally speaking, Yannai and Rebbe Lazar Koller did this as well. Piyutim were written as a system. In other words, one for the bracha Magen Avram. And then you did another one for the bracha Machaya Mason, another one leading into the V'ata Kodesh or whatever it is. So you created a system. And you only put your name in one of them. Maybe two of them, but you didn't put your name in each one. You just, because it was one long composition with breaks, you only put your name in one of them. And so when you say that Yannai's name is in it, we don't expect to find it in every single one. You expect to find it in one of a broader whole. All right, now that's going to lead us to another piece from the Cairo Geniza. This also is at Cambridge. And this is a collection of piyutim that is a system for Yom Kippur. There's no doubt about this. It's definitely Yom Kippur, and this is manuscript Hebrew D55-9. That's the call number. And basically you have it's a system of piyutim. It's a whole number of them in a row. And piyut number Dalid reads like this. It reads Ashanein pilach Eloika. I will repeatedly speak of your wonders, God. Azamra Aviga, I will sing until I am worn out, until I'm tired. And look at the next line. Yegadlach nitzchach, we will grandize your eternity. Yahalalach yekarach, we will praise your preciousness. Kadosh. Notice the word Yannai there in Yegadlach nitzchach yahalalach yekarach. Yannai, Kadosh. Okay? And then look at the fourth line. Yehi noyam. May the pleasantness of Yom Yofi, of this beautiful day, be aleinu lakdishach, to sanctify you, Kadosh. Yehi noyam. Yom Yofi is again Yannai. And so, in this system of piyutim, the fourth piyut, talking about Yom Kippur, has Yannai's name. Why is that important? That's important because piyut number 10 in this same manuscript, in this system, is Ha'oiches B'yad Mishpat, V'chol Maaminim Shehu. And so, as a result, this is where you start making somewhat of leaps to say, well, if his name is in 4, and we assume 10 is part of the same system, so then again, as I said before, you don't expect his name to be in each and every one, so therefore we should assume that he indeed, Yannai, this Yannai is the one who wrote the piyut V'chol Maaminim. The reason this is, you have to be a little cautious, is Menachem Zulai is the scholar who made this suggestion, but he also said, we can't say for sure. And the reason you can't say for sure is this same piyut Dalid is in a different system of piyutim. So maybe that's where it belongs, and someone just dragged it into here. That's number one. Number two is in this system that we're talking about today, piyut ches is clearly from Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. So already things are a little fishy, and so therefore you can't not be 100% sure. So Menachem Zulai said, I think so, but you can't know 100%. So I guess this is where this statement is coming from in the beginning of in this machzer, where they told us two things. They said he's the teacher. We know where that comes from. That comes from the Hamburg manuscript, the same one with the scorpion, and we know where it's coming from. That V'chol Maaminim comes from Yannai. It comes from this manuscript in Cambridge where we have Yannai's name in piyut 4, and we have piyut yud V'chol Maaminim a little later on. But the emes is that there's another attribution for this piyut. For whatever reason, it's not as well known, but it does exist. And if you go back to this very same Hamburg manuscript, remember it has a pirush on the piyutim. So in addition to giving you information about Yannai in the context of the Shabbos Hagadol piyut, it also gives a commentary on ha'oiches biad midas mishpat. You could see that on the left-hand image on the bottom. What does it say right on top of the ha'oiches over there? It says, V'zeh yasad Rabbi Yochanan. V'zeh yasad Rabbi Yochanan. This was composed by Rabbi Yochanan. And in fact, we have this in another manuscript of the same commentary as well. This in the National Library in Eretz Yisrael, where it says Rabbi Yochanan Yasad ha'oiches biyad midas, that Rabbi Yochanan is the one who composed this piyut ha'oiches biyad midas mishpat. We know of a Yochanan ben Yeshua HaKoyen. He's another one of the piyutim we knew nothing about pretty much, but then with the Cairo Geniza we started finding things, and so we know his name. So to me, I don't know, you're going to go with the Yannai attribution based on the information that we saw? You go with these two edus of these manuscripts that are attributed to Yochanan. I don't know. To me, it's a little shaky going with the Yannai attribution, but whatever. This I gave you the background of where it's coming from, and I guess you can make your own determination in that regard. Okay, let's continue along. So now we learned a little bit about the possibilities of where this piyut come from. I want to do one little piece that tells us on the Chasidus of this piyut during the Middle Ages. And this is going to come to us from the Maharil. The Maharil is Rabbi Yaakov Alevi Moilin. We actually just marked his yahrzeit, Chav Beis Elul, and the 600th anniversary of his yahrzeit is coming up in the year in 2 years. Yeah, it's 1427 is when he passed away. So this is what he says. He says, the Seder of the Psukim before ha'oiches, remember ha'oiches is V'chol Maaminim, b'tfilas musaf, so ha'yamesadar Mahari Segal. Okay, let me clarify. Maharil didn't write the Sefer, his student did. So that's why it's speaking about him as somebody else. Mahari Segal is Rabbi Yaakov, and he was a Levi, so Segal. Bahai Seder. You have right there before V'chol Maaminim, you have Be'emei Litz Yosher, you have Chamoil Ma'asecha, you have what's the other one over there? Chamoil Ma'asecha, Be'emei Litz Yosher, and I don't remember. Oy Diskarlonim. So there's different orders in how you do it. In fact, if you look at our machzer, look at Ne'ilah and look at Musaf, you'll see Ne'ilah Yom Kippur, and look at Musaf or Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, you'll see the way we do it Musaf or Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is a different order than the way it's done in Ne'ilah. So that's what he's getting into over here, of what the Seder was. And then the last thing you do, he says, is Be'ein Meilitz Yosher, which allows you to finish with the words V'satkenu ba'mishpat hamelach hamishpat ve'az, and then he would say ha'oiches b'neshimas hamishpat. He would say ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat. He would say that with the same breath. So he said v'satkenu ba'mishpat hamelach hamishpat ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat, and he would say it all with one breath. Neshima achas l'shtei atevos, one breath for both. He doesn't give a reason here in Maharil why the Maharil did this. I should point out the obvious, what emerges from here, and we know this from elsewhere. The Maharil was a chazan. He writes about this numerous times in the Sefer that the Maharil was the chazan, and here when he was the chazan, he did this in such a way where he went Sadkenu ba'mishpat, hamelach hamishpat, straight into Eiches be'ad midas mishpat, which is the beginning of the V'chol Maaminim piyut. Then, after he finished this piyut, and notice, by the way, he's calling it ha'oiches. This is very important. As I mentioned earlier, no one calls it ha'oiches today, because in our minds, the beginning is V'chol Maaminim. All of it is shoinim. Every single one of them, they refer to it as ha'oiches. And that's because those are the opening words of the piyut. Ha'oiches is not 4 random letters that are there in the beginning. Ha'oiches is the first word of this piyut. Okay. After he finished ha'oiches, the Maril would bend down and v'hiskir masha hiskir. He would say what he said. And I heard it being said that one of his students, and he gives his name, asked the Maril to tell him what was the thing he was saying after ha'oiches. In other words, he was mumbling something quietly. Because when he was a chazan, he also wanted to say it. Apparently, it's like, oh, chazanim need to say this secret message. The loy ratza legalis loy, and the Maharil did not want to reveal it to him. So you see, there's something going on in the beginning and in the end. In the beginning, linking it to the words before. At the end, saying presumably something Kabbalistic. There is a sefer that reports what it was. I'm not going to get into it right now. The main akuda is that he didn't want to share it. What I think this shows you is that this piyut V'chol Maaminim wasn't treated like the rest. It was treated a little differently. It was treated as more important, deserving therefore the special treatment on both ends of it. Okay, now if we could go back a few centuries, but actually, how was this sung then? Come back to our question. How was it actually sung? How was it actually chanted? All right, could we go back in time to hear? So the answer is yes. We are able to go back in time, and we're actually able to hear of how this sounded in the shuls. Okay, so first up, we're turning to the Sefer Noye Katzoin Yosef. The Sefer Noye Katzoin Yosef was printed in the early 1700s, and it documents the minhagim of Frankfurt. So in other words, this Yid, Rabbi Yosef Yusbah HaLevi, he wants that the minhagim that are happening in his day in Frankfurt, early 1700s, he wants it to be documented, and so he writes the minhagim, a very, very important source. So he writes like this. First of all, we open up the Aron for ha'oiches. We say ha'oiches b'psichas Aron kodesh. Then, remember we do v'tzadkenu b'mishpat hamelech hamishpat and ha'oiches at one breath, like Maharil told us. Why? Here he gives a reason. D'yishtama mihu, so that you're able to know who this the words ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat. Who's ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat? So no, it's hamelech hamishpat. That's ha'oiches. So in other words, ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat on its own, those words is he who grasps the attribute of mishpat. Who? Oh, hamelech hamishpat ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat. And so that, by saying it with one breath, you're clarifying who it is. Okay. Now we read the key words. V'akol oinin al kol charuz v'charuz v'chol maaminim shehu. And the congregation answers to every single stanza the words V'chol Maaminim shehu. So what does kol charuz v'charuz mean? Kol charuz v'charuz means, go back to the first page, the chazan would say, ha'oiches bi'ad midas mishpat. That's all he would say. And the crowd would answer, V'chol Maaminim shehu keilamuna. The chazan would say, ha'boichen uvaydei ginzei nestares. And the crowd would say, V'chol Maaminim shehu boichen kloyes. Okay, he then goes on to say that there was an exception for some of them. They didn't say V'chol Maaminim shehu, because shehu in his mind didn't make sense al pi diktuk, so instead of shehu they said it differently. Okay, that doesn't matter for us. This becomes even clearer when you come to the end. Kishashatz, go down 2 lines. Kishashatz oimer hashove umashva katan v'gadol. So when the shliach tzibur comes all the way to the end, he does his, when it comes to shin, he does his part of the shin. What's his part of the shin? Hashava umashva katan v'gadol. What's the call supposed to do? They're supposed to respond with v'chol maaminim shu shofet tzedek. However, he goes on to say, here the call actually does the next 2 lines as well. They say tough, and not only they say tough, they say both ends of tough. He doesn't explain why. And then the chazan goes ahead and says, V'chol maaminim shu shofet tzedek, hatamu mitamam intamimim, v'chol maaminim shehu tamim palei. My best bet for what was happening here at the end was that we wanted the chazan to end. We didn't want the call to end. And so if you want the chazan to end, so at a certain point, the call needs to kind of hand the reins back to him. And so that's what's happening there. This is the way of getting the chazan to end rather than the call ending. But ultimately what you see from this source is someone who's writing the minhagim in Frankfurt, a community that was well known, as many communities in Ashkenaz, for trying to keep their minhagim as best as they can, decade after decade, century after century. And he's telling you that the way it worked was the chazan did the first half, the call did the second half. In other words, the layout that you have in the typical machzor of the right hand and V'chol Maaminim on the left hand is the perfect layout. That's exactly how things were done in those days. If there's a problem, the problem is with the song and nothing else. We get a second source from Germany. This goes a little further back. This brings us into the 1500s. And this comes from another important community, Worms. Minhagos Vermaisa. Now, in the last year, we quoted from Minhagim of Vermaisa, but that's actually a different collection of Minhagim that's later. This volume is produced by Rabbi Yehuda Kirchheim, was printed for the first time in the 1980s. He says something very similar. You start out loud. Everyone says, not everyone says. The Chazan says, and the call says, V'chol Maaminim shu kelamuna, v'chein oimrim hakol, keseder hazen. This is what's done at Shefet Tzedek. Remember, at Shin, it switches. But till you get to Shin, this is what's done. And so, can we go back in time and hear how this piyut was once upon a time was sung? The answer is yes. We can. And we know Ha'oiches be'amidas mishpat is what the Chazan said, and V'chol Maaminim shu kelamuna was the call's response. And as we spoke about before, everything makes so much sense about the piyut in this way. And Aleph corresponds with Aleph. Each V'chol Maaminim is corresponding to the line that preceded it. It makes perfect sense. Everything is perfect here. The only problem is, that's not how we sing it today. And maybe these people, if they came and they heard us singing it today, where all these songs begin with V'chol Maaminim shu kelamuna and spills into Abeichin Oved Giz and Stories, maybe they would be horrified. I don't know. But now comes to the question of, so how did this even change? How did this even change? So the earliest person I was able to find who addressed this issue, I'm not saying he's the earliest, it's the earliest I was able to find, is in the Sefer Oitzer Kol Minhagei Yeshurun by Avram Eliezer Hershowitz. I don't expect you to remember this, but when we spoke about Kol Nidre, we discussed this individual and his Sefer Oitzer Kol Minhagei Yeshurun. Okay, so he there asks this question pretty clearly. He wants to know, why is it that we sing the piyutim in ways that look different from the way it's printed in the Machzor? So he said like this. Back in the day when these piyutim were first written, there was no printing. And therefore, all of piyutim had to be done by manuscript, which means that in any community you only had one or two, and basically only the Chazan had a Machzor. This is one thing that he says. Only the Chazan had a Machzor. All right, that's a very reasonable thing. So therefore, he says, when it came to these piyutim, I would have said, so therefore the Chazan just said it out loud and everyone in the kol was quiet and didn't say anything. But he goes to say, give an alternative. He says, no, what happened was, he's working here with a different piyut, so we'll talk about it more in a moment. The Chazan would say, Ato alekeinu b'shamayim v'aretz. Notice that has two halves. Ato alekeinu, that's the aleph, b'shamayim v'aretz, that's the base. And anu akol b'shamayim v'aretz, and the call answered. Now, the call couldn't answer all. You can't remember, right, when you say Tehillim, la na'atayach, so that you could do. But when the guy goes, right, so then you hear the way the crowd, you can't follow the whole long pasuk. So he's saying that what happened is, the Chazan said, Ato alekeinu b'shamayim v'aretz. The call can't say the whole thing, that's too hard. So they just picked up in the last words, they just said b'shamayim v'aretz. That's it. Same thing. Ha'oiches biyad mishpat. So he says, the Chazan said, Ha'oiches biyad midas mishpat, v'chol maaminim shu kelamuna. And then the crowd answered just the second half, because that they have enough memory to remember the last 5 words. Okay. Then he goes on to say that then we had printing. We got machzorim. Machzorim, everyone had a machzor. So I come to shul, I hear the Chazan go, Ha'oiches biyad midas mishpat, v'chol maaminim shu kelamuna, and I'm like, okay, I got to do my job, v'chol maaminim shu kelamuna. But then I look at my machzor and I'm like, oh, there's some extra words over there that the Chazan's going to be saying in a minute. Well, why should I not say it? Oh, you know what? Habeichin oved Giz in stories. Okay, then the Chazan goes, Habeichin oved Giz in stories, and I do my job. I say, v'chol maaminim shu beichin kloyes. Then I'm like, I might as well, there's some words over there, I have it in front of me. Hagoyim imavis ufeida mishachas. Okay, then the Chazan goes, and I repeat, that's my job. And then, okay, whatever, you get the point. This is what he says happened. And as a result, he says, suddenly, what happens is, look at what the kol is doing. The kol is saying, V'chol Maaminim first, and then they're sneaking in the haboichein, And so it ends up being that V'chol Maaminim is the first half and Abaychein is the second half, and this is how we suggest the whole thing got messed up or whatever. Now, there's two issues with this. This is, again, a little technical, but still. Two issues. Number one, the evidence does not suggest, at least from the earlier sources, that the Chazan was saying first half, second half, and the Kol was repeating second half. The evidence suggests that the Chazan was saying first half. And again, if people didn't have a machzor, they didn't do anything probably. And people did have a machzor, responded with the second half. So that I'm not so sure about it. But you could still preserve his basic point. You could repackage his basic point the same way. Let's go with that. The Chazan used to say, the Kol used to say, at a certain point, I don't know why, at a certain point, the Kol said, why should I only say V'chol Maaminim? I also want to say, and so the same idea ended up happening. And remember, and just like the Kol added, then the Chazan would also add. So the Chazan like, why should I only say I also want to say V'chol Maaminim, and maybe that's basically how things did. Why this happened, I don't know. I don't have a convincing explanation for why this happened or when this happened, but this is basically, you go, different people who write articles or books on piyutim, everyone basically says some variation of something like this, but as far as I can tell, Hershowitz is the first person to discuss this issue. Okay, now the truth is, we focused all on V'chol Maaminim, or maybe now I should not call V'chol Maaminim anymore. Maybe I should call it Ha'oiches. I don't know. Minig Yisrael Torah. But you have really the same thing by other piyutim, which is why I thought about this. You can't come up with an explanation that works only for V'chol Maaminim, because it has to be an explanation that works for all the different piyutim. And we say the same thing, so let's go to the piyut that we say in Shachar, Rosh Hashanah, and Kippur. Ato alekeinu b'shamayim v'aretz, Gibber v'naratz, dogol merva. I don't know where to stop. Okay, so in the new printing, you have on the right-hand side, Ato alekeinu is like the introduction at the top. And that reflects how generally the Chazonim sing it. B'shamayim v'aretz is the Reisha, and Gibber v'naratz is the Seifa. Dogol merva is the Reisha, and Husach v'yei is the Seifa. And then Ramo Misnase is the Reisha, Sheikh and Shchakim is the end, and then we like having hanging words at the end, so we have the Yasim of Toila Eretz al Blima. Okay? So you have all the problems that we spoke about before in terms of why do you have an Alman in the beginning and a Yasim at the end, and then you have another problem over here in terms of the meaning. Look at there's basically no correspondence to the meaning. Look on the left-hand side. This is the older machzorim are printed. Ato alekeinu on the right, b'shamayim avaretz. That's the seifa. Gibor v'naretz is the reisha. Dogol merva seifa. Now look at the next one. Husach v'yehi. He spoke and there was. That's the reisha. V'tziva v'nivro. That's the seifa. He commanded and it was created. That makes a lot of sense. The hey and the vav are in perfect correspondence. But if you go to the other model, you have dogol mervava husach v'yehi. And then you say v'tziva v'nivro zichra l'netzach. So you completely disassociated, you severed husach vayeh from v'tziva v'nivro. Likewise in the next one, in the original way, it's zichra l'netzach is the reisha. His memory is forever. Chai elamim. He lives forever. That makes perfect sense as a reisha and a seifa. If you go to the new way, it's laid out, which reflects the way the Chazonim sing it. You don't have that correspondence. It's the same thing that happened, that ultimately this new layout reflects how the Chazonim are singing it. Why are the Chazonim singing it? Well, it wasn't originally that way. Originally we assume. The Chazan said, Atu alekeinu, and the people responded, Bashamayim ba'aretz. The Chazan said, Gibor v'naretz, and the people responded, Dogol mervava. And then, at some point, it looks like the people started doing the job of the Chazan as well. The Chazan started doing the job of the people, and then from this way, in this way, it seems, it turned around. Another piyut where this is seen, and it actually adds an important element, is the piyut that we discussed last year. The piyut Melech Elyon, and its corresponding piyut, the Maaseh Elokeinu. You have two Melech Elyons that we say on Rosh Hashanah, and typically the way it's read in Shul is the first two words are kind of ignored. Melech Elyon, it's ignored. And then you read Kel Dar B'Amorim, Ader B'Amorim, Oimes Yadei Tarim, Ladei Adim Loich Melech Elyon. Right? That's how it's generally sung. Now, we know by definition it can't be, based on what we spoke about last year. There used to be a whole stanza in there of Melech Elyon. So you had a major traffic jam to go Ladei Adim Loich Melech Elyon. You couldn't do that. You had like two lines over there. Eventually, it came out. Why it came out is what we discussed last year. I'm just trying to highlight how, whatever, this is just something that we do in all these piyutim, and In some of them, they, I guess, kind of work. They're not as bad. And others, they kind of are funnier. And Melech Hayan, it's funnier simply if we know the origins of this piyut. Okay. Now, there's a lot of commentary that has been given on the different piyutim. Chasidus generally does not talk often about the piyutim. But V'chol Maaminim does get attention, interestingly. V'chol Maaminim does get attention. And what's interesting is that in the Maimarim, when they are explaining it, so sometimes they just explain one line, fine, so I'm not including that in the discussion. When they explain 2 lines, you actually see that they're linking it the way it's supposed to be read, rather than the way it's commonly sung. So we'll see 2 examples of this. So first up is in Sefer Mamarim Tafresh Lamed Ches. This is a Maimer the Rebbe Marash said, Motzei Rosh Hashanah, Tafresh Lamed Tes, that's 1878. Rosh Hashanah 1878. The Maimer the Rebbe Marash said is the Dibur HaMasel V'chol Maaminim Shu Shofet Tzedek. All believe that he is Motzei Rosh Hashanah Lamed Tes. It's printed in Sefer Mamarim Lamed Ches. But the Maimer was said, Motzei Rosh Hashanah Lamed Tes. Why is it printed in Sefer Mamarim Lamed Ches? I do not know. It's probably in that V'chol, but I don't know. V'chol Maaminim Shu Shofet Tzedek is a Dibur HaMaschil. Now this itself, you're not going to have a Dibur HaMaschil. This itself is showing it like it's recognizing it as the beginning of a sentence, not as the end of the sentence.
From the end of the year.
Huh?
This is from the end of the year. The end of the year without a test.
Yeah, but Motzei Rosh Hashanah Lamed Tes is already the new year.
Right, so this was part of the previous year's book.
Okay, but there's a separate book for Lamed Tes. Usually the Rosh Hashanah Maimer would be in that, but I don't know. I didn't spend time looking. Honestly, I didn't spend time on this. All right, the Dibur HaMaschil is V'chol Maaminim Shu Shofet Tzedek, as I alluded to before. This is recognizing the beginning. Dibur HaMaschil doesn't start halfway through. So this is kind of the way we typically think about the song. Okay, he goes on to say like this. In the piyut, he goes and he says, God is hashava umashva. God's the great equalizer. What does it mean? So he actually makes the following explanation. Hashava means God is always equal, means God doesn't change. That corresponds to the concept of ani Hashem lo shonisi. Hashava means God doesn't change. Umashva katan v'gadol. What does it mean that God makes it equal for a small and a big one? That's similar to the pasuk that it says in Iyuv. That we're not going to recognize the prince in the presence of or choosing or show favoritism to the prince over the poor person. Well, because God makes all people equal, that's why. So what's the cause? What's the effect? The cause is and everyone's equal, and therefore he could be a shofet tzedek. Okay, that's not the way we sing it. We read Shofet Tzedek, Hatamim Itamim Tamimim, or whatever it is, something like that. If you want to access this level where God is a Shofet Tzedek, where everyone is equal, so we need to do an avodah in such a way that has elements of equalness. So what type of avodah has elements of equalness? V'hi tshuva. Tshuva is equal for everyone? What? Some people did avedas, some people didn't do avedas. No. Sharei tshuva ein al avedas dafka, ki in lashuv mebchina shu emet shav v'lave l'madrega yesanala. Tshuva means return from where you are now, get closer to Hashem. Tshuva is not necessarily for sins. Therefore, tshuva is the great equalizer. Every single person needs to do it. And in that way, we are pretty much all in the same boat. When we do tshuva, so then we're tapping this level of the Eibishter where he is the Shofet Tzedek. And why is he the Shofet Tzedek? Because the cause, well, again, because he's Mashve, Katan, V'Gadol. So that's a few lines for the Maimer of the Rebbe Marash that has not only a pirush on V'chol Maaminim, but a pirush that seems to recognize that the V'chol Maaminim is the second half, not the first half of a sentence. We get an even deeper perspective from the Rebbe Rashab, the Sefer Mamorim Tov Reish Samach Gimel, and here it's the same Dibur HaMaschil. V'chol Maaminim Shu Shofet Tzedek. It's the same Dibur HaMaschil. The Koydem Lazal Omer Hashav Masha Kadam V'Gadol. And so you see, he's going to link. The Hashav Masha Kadam V'Gadol is the information before, and that's important for V'chol Maaminim Shu Shofet Tzedek. So it's like, yeah, on the one hand, you have both sides here. On the one hand, this is the way it's supposed to be. On the other hand, this is the way it is. People say V'chol Maaminim. Okay. And he asks the question, the tzarech love, and we have to understand, what is the connection between Hashava and Mashve to the fact that God is a Shofet Tzedek? What does one have to do with the other? How could you be Shaveh or Mashve? How could you say everyone is equal, a katan and a gadol? Mishpat by definition means it's lefias chus, what you deserve. And everyone deserves something else. So what does it mean that everyone is equal when it comes to God's judgment? Are you going to say, no, it means no bias, that you don't show favoritism. That's what it means. No, that's not a shavach lamayla. To come to and say about the Eibusher, by the way, the Eibusher doesn't choose and show favoritism to one person over the other. That's a praise for Hashem. No, it's saying something else. It's saying that mamish, everyone is equal. But everyone's equal? What do you mean? Everyone is different in terms of their merits. Another question he asked, what's Shat Shofet Tzedek? Do you think, like you're saying that he's not corrupt? That's a praise to Hashem. By the way, God, you're not corrupt. Something's missing over here, the Rebbe Rashab says. He goes on to explain Ba'ariches, the kitzer of the beer, in summary, goes like this: that you have the levels of Hashem that are chesed and gvura, midas hadin and midas harachmim. And when Hashem operates within those levels, that's a shofet. Because what is a shofet? A shofet needs to say, are we going to be chesed or are we going to be gvura? Are we going to be rachmim? Are we going to be chesed or are we going to be din? But then what happens is, the shofet becomes shofet tzedek. Not stama shofet. A shofet becomes shofet tzedek. What's shofet tzedek? Shofet tzedek means that a much higher level of Hashem is accessed. He calls it here rachamim pshutim. And rachamim pshutim is mamish. It's so deep within Hashem. It's like you're having intimacy. You're close with Hashem. Or pnei melachayim. So now there's life. Life for who? Life for everyone. At that level, kulam shavim l'toiver. Everyone's equal. And that's why you have Hashava Mashva Katan V'Gadol. Hashava Mashva Katan V'Gadol means I know you did maybe more mitzvahs, you did fewer mitzvahs, etc. People are taka different. But at this level, this deeper level, Shava Mashva Katan V'Gadol. How did that happen? How did you have Hashava Mashva Katan V'Gadol, which was the first half of the sentence, Lefishu Shofet Tzedek, because we had not just Shofet, we had Shofet Tzedek. Again, shofet means you're operating within the midos. Shofet tzedek means that nimshach mimchinas atzmus or sof, and that comes into the midos of zah. And then now chesed is not chesed and gvura is not gvura. Now you have rachmim pshutim. Rachmim pshutim is embracing of all, and that causes shavo mashva katan v'gadol, and that's marachem al kulam, and that is the shavach that we're saying over here in this kata. We're just going to conclude now. So I showed you two pieces of Maimarim, Reb Marash, Reb Rashab, where it's giving a beer. The Reb Rashab's beer is more tzamud to pshat. The Reb Rashab's is much more al pi Chasidus, but the common denominator between the two is it's recognizing Shavel Masha Katan V'Gadol comes before V'chol Maaminim Shehu Shofet Tzedek, even as the Dibur Maschil is V'chol Maaminim Shehu Shofet Tzedek. Okay. Now, this last point, and we're going to conclude with this, this last point about the Rachamim Pshutim comes across in a new mimer that was just published for Rosh Hashanah, Tafshin Pei Gimel. So literally 3 years ago. The end of Tafshin Pei Beis this came out. A new manuscript from the library was discovered. It's in the handwriting of the Reb Marash, and it's a very, very short mimer. It is what the Tzemach Tzedek said on Rosh Hashanah Taf Reish Yod Zayin, that is 1856. Rosh Hashanah 1856. The mimer begins like this: Chruz V'chol Maaminim. So we have the poetic stanza of V'chol Maaminim. Now you get a very interesting line. Oimrim sheyasad oisei hakoler. They say that it was written by Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. This is a very interesting line. Well, now why does he say this? He says this because if he's going to bother you with asking a question, we need to know that it's worth asking the question. And it's only worth asking the question if everything is bediuk. It is bediuk if it comes from someone like Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. So before he asks this question, he tells you, Oimrim, that it comes from Elazar HaKoler. I don't know a source of where it says that V'chol Maaminim comes from Elazar HaKoler. And when they publish this mimer, they have tons of footnotes. They don't know of a source either. But what they did do is they said, some people say it's Yannai, and they wrote, there's no source to say that it's Yannai. All right? So you have to make a determination. Is that a fair summary to say that there's no source that it comes from Yannai? I don't know, you're going to have to figure that out based on what we said before. But the Lashon of the Tzemach Tzedek written down by the Reb Marash was, Oimrim, they say, Sheyasad oisei hakoler. And then it comes to the question, what's the question? What does it mean, Adon Yechidi l'chol v'olam? What does it mean that he is the sole judge for all inhabitants? We have a pasuk, Vashem Pakad Sarah, that God answered Sarah. And we have Chazal tell us that Hashem, anytime it says Havaya, it's Havaya hu beis dinoi. In other words, it's not God alone, it's God and his Bezdin. And when did Hashem Pakad Asara happen? It happened on Rosh Hashanah. So in other words, to simplify it, we have here something very simple. We have, on the one hand, the source that says God's done Yechidi. On the other hand, we have this concept of Hashem hu beis dinoi. So what's going on? Is it Hashem Yechidi or is it with his Bezdin? This is the question of the Maimer. What does this very short Maimer answer? It says like this: before we blow the shofar, we say the pasuk Allah Elikim B'Sru Hashem V'chol Shofar. Chazal already noticed that this pasuk begins with the word Elikim, and that is Midas Hadin. That's where we get exactly what we deserve, and that is a level of Hashem and the Beis Din. Elikim could, in fact, refer to judges. Elikim could refer to angels. And so therefore it makes a lot of sense. Allah Elikim B'Sruah, that first half of the pasuk is referring to Hashem and his Bezdin. However, when we're working in that model, sometimes we're not going to be Zoicha B'Din. Sometimes yeah, but sometimes Lahepich. So if we're Zoicha B'Din, good, then we stick with that. It's good to have one, like in the lower court. I won even in the lower court. Allah Elikim B'Sruah. I won even in Elikim. But im lav, if however the Elikim didn't work, then we go to the second half of the pasuk. Then we go Hashem B'Kol Shofar, and Hashem B'Kol Shofar. This is not Elikim, and here it's Hu Levada Yisbarach Dan. Here the Eibishter himself does it. If the Eibishter himself is doing it, it's a much higher level. It's Rachmim Pshutim, which is the same lashon that we had in the previous Maimer. Rachmim Pshutim doesn't matter what a person did. Lachenu Moichel V'Saleach, and therefore Nimtza Kishneim Emes. Both are true. Rosh Hashanah is Hashem hu beis dinoi. Yes, that's true. That's the first step. But then, if that doesn't work, then from Allah Elikim B'Sruah, we go to Hashem B'Kol Shofar, and now it's the Eibishter alone without his bed. So he says, now he can say something very geschmack. When do we read Hashem Pakad Asara? We say we read it because it happened on Rosh Hashanah. That is done before Tkiyah Shofar. So that's Hashem Pakad Asara, and that is Havayo Beis Dinoi before Tkiyah Shofar. Taka, the Yom Hadin of pre Tkiyah Shofar is Hashem hu beis dinoi. Reference in the pasuk Hashem Pakad Asara. Aval achat Tkiyah Shofar. But after we blow the shofar, Az Hashem B'Kol Shofar, then we move to the second stage. That's the level of Hu Levadoi. That's without Bezdin. And that's why when do we say V'chol Maaminim? Only in Musaf, not in Shachris. Because in Musaf we say Don Yechidi. You can't say Don Yechidi unless you heard the shofar. And when you didn't hear the shofar yet, so then V'Hashem Pakad Asara, Hashem hu beis dinoi. Okay, so for me, this is all a reminder that there's a lot of work, creativity, Havana, Chasidus, all these wonderful things in these compositions. There's so many of them. So let's try to find the time, one here, one there, to try to unpack and make it a little more meaningful. Wishing you all a Shana Tova U'Mesuka.